there guys, it's Ben again, here to bring you another video, and in this video we're going to talk about chivalry. So what was chivalry? Well, there's a lot of different ideas out there, and chivalry as a concept did vary between the different geographical regions and over the period of the Middle Ages and the medieval period. So if you can imagine that chivalry as a notion was slightly different in France to what it was in what is now the United Kingdom, or different to again in places like Italy. So there were variations, and different lords and barons and earls may have had different expectations of their knights. But overall, chivalry as a concept remained, relatively speaking, consistent right across the board. So let's take a look at what are the different values that made up chivalry. Well, the first is professionalism. So obviously a knight needed to be good at what they did. Otherwise there was absolutely no point in them being a knight. And in fact, the path to knighthood for a noble boy, because I say boy because all of the knights that we know of were female. There isn't a single female knight in recorded history. That's not to say that women didn't fight, but it is to say that we don't know of any actual historical female knights. Joan of Arc and Elizabeth I were not actually knights. Rightio. So going back to professionalism, obviously a boy had to be able to demonstrate a desire to be a knight at a very young age. Typically around age 6 or 7, they would already have to master the basics of being in control of a horse, and so they would have to be able to demonstrate equine mastery and already have a basic knowledge of many of the different sort of weapons, such as spears and a sling and a sort of a bow and arrow, which you would be able to expect them to do, because at this sort of age in a noble household it was not unreasonable to expect the boys of this age group to be providing some of the food. Rightio, the next concept is faithful. Okay, you needed to be able to demonstrate faith in not only in Christianity, because again knights were knights were religious people, and faith in Christianity was a big thing. They also needed to be faithful to their master, whether that be an earl, a baron, or the king. They needed to be faithful to the other sort of parts of chivalry and be able to demonstrate that. Honesty. Okay, so obviously a knight was expected to be honest, and in this day and age we use the term integrity, but honesty and being able to show that. So to be able to show that they were not only speaking the truth but doing the truth, and willing to be seen to do that and unseen to do that as well. Prowess. This is an interesting one. Not only does this go back to professionalism, but to me prowess not only encompasses the sort of courageous and brave acts that you would expect of a knight in this time. So for example, we know about some incredibly brave acts that were undertaken by knights during the Crusades, and often these knights would have known that the acts that they were doing were going to probably lead to their deaths, and yet they went on and did it anyway, in the concept of being of protecting the people whom they were charged to protect. So, and undertaking the duties of a knight, and they understood that this may very well lead to their deaths. But also prowess to me is not, in Australia we would call it sort of big noting yourself or high noting yourself, the sort of tall poppy. No, we're not looking at someone who does things just to be sort of seen. We're looking at someone who is doing these things in an unseen way as well. So modesty with that professionalism and being able to be confident in their skills and their attitudes. Generosity. So in generosity, we're talking, I guess, about the fact that knights lived a life of violence and battle. So in many cases, knights may as well not saving up too much money for their retirement. They may very well not get there. We know that many did. We know William Marshall, for example, died in his 70s in battle, but many other knights would have died at a much younger age doing their job. Courtesy is the next one, and I think this is a big, fairly obvious one. Knights and the whole concept of chivalry, a large amount of this focused on being courteous to women. So as I said before, all of the knights that we know of were men, and a big part of that was being courteous to women. So when a boy set out on his path to become a knight, often at, as I said, a very young age, 5, 6 or 7, he would have to go through that process of being a page boy. We still refer to page boys in wedding ceremonies and so on, but actual historical page boys had a much wider range of different jobs that they needed to do, and a lot of that was in service to women. So franchise is the next one. And by franchise, I don't mean the same kind of franchise that we have today. We're not sort of looking to duplicate one type of retail outlet to another, but rather I believe that this is also looking at a knight would always, to my knowledge, have squires, and a squire was basically a knight in training from usually the age of kind of the early teens, maybe as young as 12, but typically in that kind of 13, 14 type area. And at this stage we've finished with the whole learning the courtesy thing. Now we're moving on to actually learning the particular skills that would be required to be a knight. And so franchise is about transferring my skills as a knight to a younger person with a hope that the skills and the knowledge and the attitudes that I can demonstrate to this younger squire can be therefore taken up by that person, and that can become their moral compass, if you like. Fealty. We sort of mentioned a little bit of this before in some of the other aspects and qualities of chivalry, but fealty, and we'll explain the sort of the fealty system a bit more in some later videos coming up, but fealty was about, as a knight, I would have a duty to support my superiors. So typically, as I said earlier, barons, earls and other major nobles, including the king. So I might have an estate as a knight of maybe, let's say, 5,000 acres, whatever, and on that estate might live 200 people. You know, maybe even as much as 500 people, depending on how well it's managed and depending on how profitable and the sort of the skills and the absence of disease is a big one. So I would need people and all sorts of different skills to maintain my property. And if I was fortunate enough, then I would have some sort of fortified area, perhaps even a castle, as many knights did. But the concept was that I might receive a message from the king or from an earl or from a baron and saying that I needed to impose a tax on my citizens, and that tax would go towards funding a particular campaign or some major infrastructure aspects or whatever it might be, and so I would then need to pass that on. So the people who lived is essentially in my care would therefore be supporting me. In other words, a historical term for that was vassal, and that vassal, which I essentially as a knight would be a vassal to my lords and my king, and so that tax would be passed up, and that's really how fealty sort of worked. The last one is nobility. You needed to behave in a noble way. That was what was expected of you. Now I understand if we look at many of the historical actions of particular knights and particular events that transpired throughout the medieval period, we can see that many knights didn't always act in a noble way. And certainly when we look back of them, through 1,000 years of progress, we can feel with our moral compass and with our sort of today's standards of ethics and morals that what happened 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, was completely unacceptable and very unnoble. But it's very difficult really to impose modern morals and ethics on a historical event, because the times were simply so different, and the values and how things worked were so different that it's just not really achievable, and it's not I don't even think it's really beneficial to try and suggest that the events of this particular day or whatever completely ruled out nobility. But that particular knight would have to act and behave in a way that was noble. And so by that, what I mean is the knight would need to treat his guests the way that that he would want to be treated, and to treat people appropriately, not only according to their social status, but just according to his moral compass. I also believe that the whole code of chivalry imposed on the knights a kind of discipline and a moral compass when it did come to fighting as well. We see that today, and I come from a legacy where I served nearly a third of my whole life. Over 14 years of my life was spent in the service of others through military service, although most of that, almost all of that really, was as what we call a medic, so technically I was a non-combatant. However, soldiers of today are under very strict guidelines and rules, such as the Hague Convention and so on, and the international rules of war and so on, as to exactly how we can behave and what we can do and what we can't do. The same kind of thing actually applies to the codes of chivalry and what happened on the medieval battlefield. There were very strict rules on how things could work and what you could be expected and how you were expected to behave. If you, for example, that you took prisoners, then you were expected to be able to treat them in a certain way. If you were a prisoner, you were expected to behave in a certain way. For example, there's a record where I believe some French nobles were taken prisoner, and now I can't remember the exact details, so if you happen to know, please leave a comment below. But my understanding is that the senior French noble decided that he had to go home to get his ransom, and the way that worked was a ransom was 1 year of your income. So for him to go home and get his ransom, he needed to leave his son behind to essentially stand in his stead. The son decided to abscond from the imprisonment under the British Knights, and he ran away. And the word got out, because the medieval nobility is actually a relatively small circle of people. And so a message was sent out by these English knights saying, does anyone know where this particular person has gone? Because they've run away. They've broken the code of chivalry, and they're not behaving in the way that they should do. Relatively soon, I believe within a couple of months, this particular person was located and actually sent back by his father to serve out the rest of his term and to have the ransom paid. So people had a much higher ethical kind of compass, and they understood the reason that they needed to behave in a certain way. So we can see that chivalry existed to provide some fairly clear boundaries around not only your military service and your behaviour as on the battlefield, but also in a domestic sense, and how you were expected to be able to treat those around you. And I believe that chivalry was a very good and very positive way of doing that for the time, and I believe that chivalry provided people with the guidelines that they needed, and I think it worked really well. I understand it was not a perfect system, and there's lots of examples where knights were doing the wrong thing, and knights were behaving in a way that wasn't very knightly and didn't work with the codes of chivalry. But for the most part, I do think it worked, and I do think that it went through, and I think that you can see, on the clothing that knights wore, such as the surcoat and so on, you would see that there were badges, and I'm actually making a surcoat at the moment, and that video will get released in a day or two. And you can see that people would have looked upon their badges and seen, okay, that's my family name, or that's my, I'm here to represent the church, or I'm here to do this. And I believe very strongly and very passionately that they would have questioned their own behaviour and their own moral compass, and am I actually achieving the goals? Am I worthy of this name? And am I worthy of these symbols and representing these symbols? Because I think that would have been very important to them. Alrighty guys, I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe and share, and I will catch you in my next video.